the address still protected. Yet something essential has been removed, not stolen, not burned, not abandoned, but quietly replaced. The mansion no longer governs itself. It is administered. What was once a sealed world of continuity now functions as an asset. Its rooms no longer remember the rhythms they were built to enforce. The walls remain thick, but they do not listen. The silence has changed. This was never a house designed to be visited. It was designed to hold distance, to regulate access, to convert wealth into permanence. Every corridor once enforced hierarchy. Every threshold was a decision about who belonged inside and who would remain unseen. The mansion did not merely display power, it practiced it daily, through routine, restraint, and exclusion. That discipline is gone. In its place is maintenance, preservation without authority, protection without belief. The transformation did not arrive with a single dramatic event. No scandal announced it. No public reckoning marked the moment. Instead, the erosion occurred slowly as the systems that once sustained the house, financial, cultural, familial, lost their coherence. Stewardship became custodianship. Legacy became branding. This story matters not because of scandal or secrecy, but because this mansion represents a form of American power that believed itself permanent. A power that mistook insulation for immortality. What remains today is not ruin, but survival, hollowed, stabilized, and carefully guarded against the very history it once embodied. The house remains. Its walls are unbroken, its roof intact, its grounds carefully tended. From a distance, nothing appears missing. Windows still hold their glass. The approach road curves as it always has, disciplined by hedges planted generations earlier. There is no ruin here, no collapse to explain the passage of time. What has changed is less visible and more decisive. The house no longer commands. Once, its presence organized the surrounding world. Movement oriented itself toward it. Labor flowed inward, decisions moved outward. The building was not merely inhabited, it functioned. Its rooms processed authority, its corridors carried instruction, its thresholds marked access and exclusion. Power was not displayed theatrically, it was embedded in routine. The house governed by being unavoidable. Today, the routines persist without purpose. Doors are unlocked at prescribed hours, paths are swept, security is discreet but constant. The systems remain, but they no longer resolve into command. The house has become an object of maintenance rather than direction. Preservation has replaced governance. What stands now is a structure protected against decay but emptied of consequence. The rooms are stabilized at controlled temperatures. Materials are cataloged, surfaces restored to earlier states. Time is curated rather than lived. The house exists within a framework of care that is procedural, not political. Its value has been redefined as continuity rather than control. This transformation did not occur through destruction. There was no moment when authority visibly departed. Instead, it thinned. Decision-making moved elsewhere, into offices without lineage, into systems without architecture. The house was not defeated, it was bypassed. Its relevance diminished not because it failed, but because the conditions that once required it dissolved. The present experience of the house reflects this shift. Visitors enter not to petition or to serve, but to observe. Movement is guided, not negotiated. Silence is encouraged, not imposed. What was once a space of consequence has become a space of interpretation. The building now receives attention rather than issuing it, yet the physical language of authority remains embedded in its design. Scale still asserts hierarchy. Ceilings still elevate certain rooms over others. Sightlines still privilege the center. These elements were not removed because they are integral to the structure itself. They persist as form without function, grammar without speech. This creates a particular tension. The house appears authoritative even when it no longer acts. Its architecture continues to suggest command, while its actual role has been reduced to representation. The result is not nostalgia, but dissonance. The building performs a version of itself that no longer corresponds to the systems outside its walls. Protection now replaces power. Legal frameworks define what may be altered and what must remain untouched. Surveillance exists to prevent damage, not dissent. The house is guarded against change rather than defended against challenge. Its survival has become an administrative objective. This is not decay, it is suspension. The house has been removed from the flow of consequence and placed into managed time. It endures, but it does not intervene. Its authority has been neutralized without being erased. The rupture, then, is not between past and present, but between presence and function. The house stands precisely where it always has, yet no longer governs the meaning of its own existence. It has become a site where authority once resided, now carefully preserved after its departure. Inside, the transformation is most apparent not in what has been removed, but in how space is now used. Rooms once designed for deliberation are traversed without pause. Chambers built to concentrate attention are now passed through in silence. The hierarchy of space remains legible, yet it no longer organizes behavior. People move freely where once they would have waited. They stand where they would not have been permitted to stand. The architecture endures, but obedience does not. The house now operates according to a different logic. Its schedules are calibrated to access rather than command. Entry is regulated by policy, not permission. The flow of bodies follows safety codes and visitor capacity, replacing older systems of rank and proximity. Authority, once enacted through presence, is now referenced only through explanation. This shift alters the nature of memory within the building. Objects remain where they were placed, but they no longer function as instruments. Desks are not worked at, chairs are not deferred to. The stillness is deliberate. Use has been replaced by display and display by interpretation. Each room holds multiple meanings simultaneously, none of them active. Authority, once inseparable from its presence, has become incompatible with its continued existence. This condition produces a subtle inversion. Where the house once shaped the world beyond its walls, it is now shaped by external systems. Cultural agencies determine its narrative. Conservation standards dictate its physical limits. Public expectation governs its accessibility. The building responds rather than directs. Even language shifts around it. The house is no longer spoken of as a place where decisions are made, but as a place where history resides. Its significance is measured in documentation, not consequence. The present tense recedes. Everything within it is framed as having already occurred. Yet the structure resists full transformation. Its materials carry weight beyond explanation. Stone does not become neutral simply because authority has withdrawn. Scale continues to impress. Distance continues to discipline. Visitors adjust their posture unconsciously, despite the absence of enforcement. The building still shapes behavior, even as it no longer demands it. This residual influence is not power in the former sense. It does not compel action or obedience. Instead, it produces awareness. The house reminds without instructing. It suggests without commanding. Its presence exerts pressure that is cultural rather than political. The result is an institution without agency. The house remains central in appearance but peripheral in function. It is acknowledged, protected, and circumscribed. Its authority has been translated into heritage. What was once unquestioned command has become curated significance. In this state, the house neither rules nor disappears. It occupies a narrow position between relevance and removal. Too intact to be dismissed, too emptied to govern. Its endurance depends on restraint on remaining exactly as it is, and no more. The house stands as evidence of a system that no longer requires it, not as a warning and not as a relic, but as a structure that has outlived the conditions of its authority. Its continued existence is quiet, controlled, and carefully bounded. The power that once moved through it has not been lost. It has relocated into processes, abstractions, and systems that no longer need walls to function. The house remains not as a center, but as a boundary. The importance of the house cannot be understood as private success scaled upward. It was never simply a dwelling enlarged by wealth. From its earliest conception, the elite American mansion functioned as an instrument designed to regulate social meaning, not merely to shelter a family. Its significance derived from what it ordered beyond its walls. In a nation that rejected inherited titles yet preserved hierarchy, such houses performed a necessary cultural task. They translated economic power into visible legitimacy. They stabilized status in a society officially committed to mobility. The mansion offered permanence where the system otherwise promised motion. These buildings emerged at moments when wealth required anchoring. Industrial fortunes accumulated rapidly, often faster than social acceptance could follow. The house resolved that instability. Through architecture, land, and ritualized space, it rendered new power intelligible. It made success appear settled, inevitable, and, crucially, respectable. Location mattered as much as scale. These houses were placed deliberately on rises above towns, along controlled approaches, or within carefully bounded enclaves. Geography reinforced hierarchy. Distance created distinction. Access became symbolic long before it was physical. To approach such a place was to cross an invisible threshold, one not marked by law, but by custom. Inside, space operated as a sorting mechanism. Rooms were not neutral containers, they were calibrated environments. Public areas invited recognition. Private rooms enforced separation. Service corridors ensured that labor remained present but unseen. Every movement through the house rehearsed social order. One learned where one belonged simply by where one was permitted to stand. The mansion did not need to announce exclusion, it embodied it. Invitations replaced enforcement. Silence replaced instruction. Those who belonged understood how to move. Those who did not felt the limits immediately. The house trained its participants through exposure rather than command. Beyond the family, the mansion served as a node within a larger network of influence. Decisions were not merely hosted there. They were legitimized by occurring within its confines. Business agreements, marriages, alliances, and introductions gained weight through proximity to the house. It conferred seriousness on what passed through it. This function was cultural rather than legal. No document required decisions to occur there. Yet presence within such spaces altered perception. Authority appeared natural when exercised from rooms designed to suggest inevitability. The house did not argue for hierarchy, it assumed it. Ritual sustained this system. Dinners, receptions, seasonal gatherings, these were not social excesses but mechanisms of continuity. Attendance signaled acceptance. Absence carried meaning. Repetition turned privilege into tradition. Over time, the house became less a location than a reference point within social memory. Importantly, these houses mattered even to those who never entered them. They defined aspiration by contrast. Their visibility structured desire and limitation simultaneously. To see such a place was to encounter an upper boundary to understand that society had ceilings as well as floors. The mansion thus operated as a stabilizing device. It reassured those within its orbit and disciplined those outside it. It provided a physical anchor for abstractions like class, legitimacy, and continuity concepts otherwise difficult to sustain in a system that claimed openness. At its height, the house mattered not because of who lived there, but because of what it quietly enforced. It was a structure that made hierarchy legible without ever naming it. Over time, repetition transformed these houses from expressions of wealth into arbiters of normality. What began as assertion hardened into expectation. The mansion did not merely reflect status, it calibrated it. By setting standards of scale, taste, and comportment, it defined what counted as success and what remained provisional. This influence extended beyond social gatherings into everyday perception. Architectural choices, symmetry, restraint, historical reference were not aesthetic preferences alone. They signaled alignment with older European traditions, borrowing credibility from forms associated with longevity and rule. In doing so, the house positioned its occupants as custodians rather than beneficiaries of power. Such alignment mattered in a society uneasy with overt aristocracy. The mansion allowed elites to perform restraint while exercising dominance. Its authority appeared inherited even when it was newly constructed. Through materials and proportion, it suggested continuity where none existed. The house taught observers to accept concentration of power as cultural stewardship. Exclusion, when it occurred, was indirect. It was accomplished through codes rather than confrontation. Dress, speech, timing, and invitation functioned as filters. The house did not close its gates aggressively, it simply required knowledge that could not be easily acquired. Those without the codes experienced exclusion as personal inadequacy rather than structural design. This subtlety was essential. Open force would have contradicted the national narrative of equality. Instead, the mansion embedded hierarchy within civility. It offered access conditionally, allowing boundaries to appear natural. The result was a system that disciplined without appearing to do so. The surrounding community absorbed these signals. Local economies adjusted around the house. Schools, clubs, and institutions oriented themselves in relation to its presence. Influence radiated outward, shaping opportunity indirectly. The mansion became a gravitational center, not through command, but through recognition. Importantly, the house also constrained those within it. Its expectations were not optional. Families inherited not just property, but obligation. Behavior was regulated by visibility. Deviation carried consequences. The mansion demanded continuity, often at the expense of flexibility. Authority required maintenance. In this way, the house functioned as both instrument and burden. It stabilized hierarchy while binding its occupants to performance. Private life was never fully private. The mansion required representation at all times. Its authority depended on constancy. What gave the house its power was not isolation but integration. It stood at the intersection of economy, culture, and perception. Remove any one of these and its influence weakened. At its strongest, it aligned them seamlessly, making hierarchy feel inevitable. This is why the place mattered. Not because of extravagance, but because it rendered inequality legible, orderly, and enduring. It gave abstract power a physical address, and in doing so, allowed it to persist without challenge. The mansion was never just a home. It was a system made visible, functioning quietly, shaping society by appearing merely to exist. The decision to build was not reactive. It did not follow crisis, nor did it respond to immediate need. Construction began as an assertion measured, deliberate, and forward-facing. In a nation still uncertain of its own duration, to build its scale was to make a claim about time. This was not architecture as shelter. It was architecture as statement. The mansion was conceived in a context where wealth could be sudden and authority provisional. Markets shifted quickly. Institutions remained unfinished. Political power circulated without settling. Against this instability, construction offered a counterweight. Stone and timber promised endurance where systems did not. The act of building announced that certain forces intended to remain. Design choices reflected this intention. The house did not experiment. It did not pursue novelty. Instead, it drew from established architectural languages classical symmetry, axial order, proportion governed by precedent. These were not aesthetic preferences so much as strategic alignments. To build in this manner was to associate oneself with traditions older than the nation itself. The mansion's scale was calibrated carefully. It exceeded necessity without courting excess. Size communicated capacity, the ability to host, to absorb, to oversee, but restraint signaled control. The building suggested that its occupants possessed enough power not to display it urgently. Permanence required composure. Materials reinforced this message. Durable stone, slow-grown wood, labor-intensive finishes. These were investments not only of money, but of time. Construction unfolded over years, sometimes decades. This duration was itself communicative. It implied patience, planning, and immunity to interruption. To sustain a project of such length was to demonstrate stability before it was proven. Placement further clarified intent. It occupied a controlled prominence visible but buffered. Approaches were designed to lengthen arrival, to separate ordinary movement from formal entry. One did not simply reach the house, one transitioned toward it. This spatial sequencing mattered. It trained perception. The house announced itself gradually, asserting presence without abruptness. Authority was framed as inevitable rather than imposed. By the time one arrived, the declaration had already been made. Importantly, the mansion did not speak to the present alone. It addressed the future. Its layout anticipated inheritance, continuity, repetition. Rooms were planned not just for current use, but for ritualized use across generations. The building assumed succession as a given. This forward orientation distinguished it from other forms of wealth display. Factories, offices, commercial buildings addressed production. The mansion addressed lineage. It proposed a future in which the same family, or at least the same class, would remain relevant. Construction thus became a wager on social endurance. The absence of defensive features is notable. No fortifications, no barriers designed for siege. The house did not expect challenge in physical terms. Its confidence lay elsewhere. It relied on recognition rather than protection. Authority was assumed to be cultural, not contested. In this sense, construction was an act of translation. Economic power was converted into spatial order. Uncertain influence was rendered solid. The house did not wait for legitimacy, it built it. The mansion stood before its authority was fully established. It was built not to celebrate permanence but to create the conditions for it. Once completed, the building did not require explanation. Its form performed its purpose continuously, without intervention. The declaration made during construction persisted through use, repetition, and endurance. What had been asserted in blueprint became normalized through occupation. The house taught those who encountered it how to interpret power. Its symmetry suggested balance. Its measured proportions implied rationality. Its historical references borrowed authority from distant origins. Together, these elements communicated inevitability. The building did not argue for its place, it assumed it. This assumption mattered in a society resistant to overt hierarchy. The mansion bypassed debate by presenting power as already resolved. It framed wealth as responsibility and scale as stewardship. The building suggested that those within it were not merely successful, but suited to permanence. Construction also disciplined the surrounding landscape. Roads aligned to the house, vistas terminated at its facade. Auxiliary buildings positioned themselves in deference. The environment was ordered around a center that claimed authority without issuing commands. Space itself became an accomplice. Inside, circulation reinforced the external message. Movement followed logic rather than convenience. Axes directed attention. Transitions marked shifts in status. Even when unoccupied, the house retained this instructional quality. It organized behavior through design alone. The completion of the mansion stabilized expectations. What had been uncertain became legible. The house served as evidence that power could settle, that it could outlast fluctuation. Its presence reassured allies and disciplined rivals. To build at this scale was to signal competence not only in resources but in outcome. Importantly, the building's authority did not depend on constant renovation. Change would have undermined its claim. Stability was essential. Alteration occurred slowly, cautiously, always in dialogue with the original declaration. The house needed to appear continuous, even as circumstances evolved. Over time, the mansion absorbed events without yielding form. Economic downturns, political shifts, social tensions, these passed through its rooms without altering its structure. This endurance reinforced its message. The building seemed untouched by forces that unsettled others, yet the declaration embedded in its construction imposed constraints. To claim permanence was to accept visibility. The house could not retreat or adapt easily. Its authority depended on consistency. Deviations risked exposure. Construction had fixed not only form, but expectation. In this way, the mansion functioned as a commitment. It bound its occupants to the future it projected. Authority, once declared in stone, demanded maintenance in behavior. The building tolerated no contradiction. Construction, then, was not an endpoint but a threshold. By building, the house entered history already positioned as enduring. Its declaration succeeded not because it was defended, but because it was allowed to stand long enough to be believed. The mansion did not wait for the nation to stabilize. It announced that stability would occur around it. The house did not operate through symbolism alone. Its authority depended on daily function. Behind the composed exterior existed a system calibrated for reliability, repetition, and control. What appeared effortless from the outside was sustained by continuous internal coordination. Staff formed the primary mechanism of this system. Hierarchy was explicit, not assumed. Roles were narrowly defined. Responsibilities segmented. Authority distributed downward in precise increments. Each position existed in relation to others, creating a chain that translated intention into action without requiring constant oversight. The house functioned because responsibility was never ambiguous. Time governed everything. Days followed schedules refined over years. Meals occurred at fixed hours, not for convenience but for order. Cleaning routines were sequenced to avoid visibility. Maintenance occurred before deterioration could be noticed. Nothing waited to fail. Anticipation was the standard. Visibility itself was regulated. Labor was essential, but presence was controlled. Staff moved through secondary corridors, staircases, and entrances designed to keep operations continuous yet unobtrusive. The house appeared calm because its work remained largely unseen. Order was preserved by separating function from display. Financial discipline underpinned this arrangement. Despite scale, the house did not operate casually. Budgets were monitored, inventories tracked, repairs documented. Excess was managed carefully. Waste suggested loss of control. Even abundance required accounting. The appearance of effortless wealth depended on meticulous restraint. Supplies entered and exited according to established channels. Deliveries were scheduled. Storage was organized to prevent shortage or surplus. The house behaved less like a residence and more like an institution, self-regulating, procedural, and risk-averse. Stability depended on predictability. Authority within the walls flowed laterally as well as vertically. Senior staff exercised discretion. Decisions were made quietly, adjusted continuously, and corrected without notice. The system valued continuity over instruction. Problems were solved before they required acknowledgement. Silence was not absence, but success. The family, while central, did not manage operations directly. Their role was representational. They moved through a system already aligned to accommodate them. The house anticipated their needs, shaped their routines, and absorbed disruption without complaint. Personal preference was secondary to institutional rhythm. This separation mattered. By insulating authority from function, the house ensured endurance. Individuals could change without destabilizing operations. The system persisted regardless of personality. Ritual reinforced this order. Formal occasions followed rehearsed sequences. Staff understood not only tasks but timing, posture, and tone. These moments were not improvised. They were executed. Precision conveyed legitimacy. Any deviation risked exposure. The architecture supported this machinery. Rooms were sized to control gathering. Sightlines managed interaction. Sound traveled selectively. The building did not merely contain activity, it directed it. Movement through space was guided to minimize friction and maximize control. What emerged was an environment where authority felt natural because it was operational. Nothing dramatic occurred. The house governed through regularity. Its power resided in repetition, not command. This system did not announce itself. It functioned quietly, continuously, and with little tolerance for interruption. The house endured not because it symbolized order, but because it produced it every day. Control extended beyond routine into contingency. The house was prepared for disruption without acknowledging it. Illness, absence, unexpected guests, seasonal shifts each had a corresponding adjustment already embedded in practice. Redundancy was intentional. Knowledge was shared selectively to ensure continuity without diffusion of authority. The system did not rely on improvisation, it relied on readiness. Information moved carefully. Messages were relayed through established channels, filtered to preserve discretion. Not everything was said to everyone. Awareness was tiered. This preserved both efficiency and hierarchy. Silence functioned as a tool, preventing unnecessary circulation of concern or conflict. The house managed knowledge as carefully as it managed space. Training occurred through proximity rather than instruction. New staff learned by observation, absorbing standards through repetition. Formal manuals were less important than consistency. Correctness was reinforced by routine, not explanation. This method ensured uniformity across generations of workers, minimizing variance over time. The house also regulated emotional presence. Expressions of fatigue, urgency, or disagreement were moderated. The system required composure. Emotional restraint was part of labor. To work within the house was to align oneself with its tempo, suppressing individual rhythm in favor of institutional pace. This discipline produced reliability, but it also imposed limits. Creativity was constrained. Initiative existed within narrow bounds. The system rewarded adherence over innovation. What mattered was not improvement, but preservation. Change introduced risk. Despite this, the system adapted incrementally. Adjustments occurred quietly, layered onto existing practice. New technologies were integrated cautiously, always subordinate to established order. Modernization served continuity, not transformation. The house absorbed change without appearing to change. Financial oversight reinforced this conservatism. Long-term sustainability outweighed short-term display. Resources were allocated to maintenance rather than expansion. Authority required longevity more than visibility. The cumulative effect was an environment resistant to external pressure. The house could accommodate events without revealing strain. Guests encountered smoothness. Public functions unfolded without interruption. The system succeeded precisely because it concealed its labor, yet this concealment depended on constant effort. Control was never complete. It had to be renewed daily. Staff monitored subtle shifts in behavior, timing, and tone. Order was not a static condition, but an ongoing process. Over time, the system became self-referential. Its primary purpose shifted from serving authority to preserving itself. Routines justified continuation. Hierarchies defended their own relevance. The house functioned efficiently, but increasingly inwardly. This inward focus marked a quiet turning point. The system remained intact, but its orientation subtly changed. It continued to operate flawlessly, even as the external conditions that once required such precision began to recede. The house did not notice this shift. Systems rarely do. They persist until context overtakes them. Within the walls, order continued, uninterrupted, long after its original function had begun to fade. At its height, the house no longer asserted itself. It did not need to. Authority had become ambient. Wealth, culture, and institutional rhythm aligned so completely that power appeared effortless. The system inside the walls operated without friction, and the world beyond them responded accordingly. This was not a moment of excess, but of equilibrium. Confidence manifested as quiet certainty. Decisions were made without urgency. Plans extended years ahead without contingency. The house moved at a measured pace because it assumed time would accommodate it. There was no need to accelerate, no reason to hedge. The future appeared continuous with the present. Daily operations reflected this assurance. Staff turnover was minimal. Routines required little correction. The house's internal system, refined over decades, functioned as intended. Maintenance blended seamlessly into ritual. Repairs were anticipated, not reacted to. Stability was not declared, it was practiced. Cultural authority reached its most integrated form. The house no longer needed to host frequently to remain central. Its relevance was assumed. Invitations carried weight precisely because they were selective. Absence from the house became notable. Presence elsewhere was measured against it. This confidence extended into relationships beyond the estate. Financial institutions deferred. Civic leaders consulted. Social organizations aligned their calendars accordingly. Influence no longer required demonstration. It operated through expectation. The house was referenced even when it was not involved. The architecture itself participated in this assurance. Surfaces showed age without neglect. Patina replaced polish. Wear was interpreted as continuity rather than decline. The building appeared settled into its role, neither expanding nor retracting. Permanence had become aesthetic. Importantly, there was no sense of defense. The house did not prepare for displacement. Its authority felt structural, embedded in systems larger than any single institution. Markets fluctuated, politics shifted, but these were perceived as surface disturbances. The underlying order seemed intact. The family mirrored this condition. Their behavior was unhurried. Public appearances were measured. Private routines followed long-established patterns. There was little need to perform legitimacy, it was assumed. The house supported this posture by absorbing uncertainty quietly. This era was characterized by alignment rather than ambition. The goal was not growth, but maintenance of position. Expansion risked exposure. Stability promised endurance. The house functioned best when it appeared uninterested in asserting itself. Control, at this stage, was almost invisible. Boundaries existed, but rarely needed reinforcement. Codes were internalized. Those within the orbit of the house understood expectations without instruction. The system governed through shared assumptions rather than enforcement. The absence of threat shaped perception. Challenges, when they arose, were treated as temporary. There was confidence that solutions would emerge through existing channels. The house trusted its own resilience. It had weathered change before. There was no reason to believe it would not continue to do so. This was the period when inevitability felt earned. The house no longer seemed like a declaration or a mechanism. It felt like a condition. Authority did not appear concentrated. It appeared distributed across culture, economy, and habit. Nothing announced that this alignment was fragile. There were no visible cracks, no disruptions in routine, no loss of confidence. The house stood not as a symbol of power, but as its natural environment. The surrounding world adapted itself to this certainty. Institutions calibrated their expectations around the house's continued presence. Agreements assumed long horizons. Relationships matured without urgency. The house did not need to intervene frequently. Its influence shaped outcomes indirectly, through alignment rather than instruction. This was also the moment when self-regulation appeared complete. The internal system required minimal oversight. Deviations corrected themselves through habit. Staff anticipated expectations instinctively. Authority circulated smoothly, encountering little resistance. The house functioned less as a site of decision-making than as a stabilizing reference. Cultural norms reinforced this equilibrium. Taste, Behavior and affiliation flowed outward from the house's example. What it accepted gained legitimacy. What it ignored faded. These judgments were rarely explicit. Influence operated through recognition, not pronouncement. The house set tone by remaining consistent, but confidence extended into how uncertainty was perceived. Economic shifts were interpreted as cyclical rather than structural. Social tensions appeared manageable within existing frameworks. The house's endurance over previous disruptions reinforced belief in its immunity. Experience substituted for analysis. Importantly, this confidence was not reckless. It was conservative. Risk was avoided not through fear, but through disinterest. The house did not pursue novelty aggressively. It trusted inherited systems. Continuity remained the central value. This orientation shaped succession. Preparation occurred quietly, without urgency. Roles were assumed gradually. Transitions were smoothed through exposure rather than announcement. The house treated continuity as procedural rather than dramatic. Change was absorbed slowly, preserving the appearance of sameness. Public perception mirrored this calm. The house appeared settled, even benevolent. Its authority felt stabilizing rather than oppressive. Critique lacked traction because power did not present itself aggressively. The house seemed to exist beyond contestation. At this peak, the alignment between internal order and external recognition was complete. The system did not merely function, it validated itself continuously. Success reinforced confidence, and confidence reinforced success. The house appeared self-sustaining. Yet this condition depended on assumptions that went largely unexamined. The absence of challenge reduced scrutiny. Systems optimized for stability rarely questioned their foundations. The house continued to operate flawlessly, precisely because nothing demanded adaptation. This was the era when authority felt most secure, not because it was defended, but because it was unquestioned. The house did not prepare for disruption. It had no reason to. Its strength lay in alignment, and alignment appeared permanent. The house stood fully integrated into its environment, exerting influence without effort. Power had become habit. Continuity felt assured, not because it was protected, but because it seemed inevitable. The change did not arrive as a shock. It arrived as friction. The house remained intact, its systems operational, its presence undiminished. Yet the conditions that once aligned so effortlessly around it began to shift. Not dramatically, not publicly, but persistently. The surrounding environment no longer moved in parallel. Small adjustments were required where none had been before. Economic patterns altered first, though not in ways immediately visible from within the walls. Capital became more mobile, less patient. Long horizons shortened. The kinds of stability that had once favored permanence began to favor flexibility instead. The house still possessed resources, but the logic governing their use had changed. Endurance was no longer assumed, it had to be justified. Financial discipline tightened. Budgets that once emphasized continuity now emphasized efficiency. Maintenance schedules were reviewed, not out of necessity, but out of prudence. The system began to measure itself against external standards rather than internal rhythm. This marked a subtle but consequential shift. The house was no longer setting the terms alone. Social currents exerted pressure more diffusely. The codes that had once filtered access so quietly began to lose coherence. Familiar markers of legitimacy no longer carried the same weight beyond the estate. Deference thinned. Proximity no longer guaranteed alignment. The house remained respected, but respect increasingly required explanation. Within the walls, routines continued, but they adjusted. Staff hierarchies remained intact, yet expectations expanded. Roles absorbed additional responsibilities. Specialization softened into versatility. The system responded not with resistance, but with recalibration. Adaptation entered where certainty had once prevailed. Ownership, too, became more complex. Authority did not vanish, but it fragmented. Decisions passed through more layers, some distant from the house itself. Accountability diffused. The building still anchored identity, but control no longer resided exclusively within it. The house became one node among others, rather than the unquestioned center. These changes did not announce themselves. There were no crises, no visible losses. The house continued to function, host, and endure. Its exterior suggested continuity. Yet internally, priorities shifted. Preservation competed with relevance. Tradition encountered negotiation. Time began to feel different. Planning horizons shortened slightly. Contingencies were acknowledged, even if quietly. The system began to ask questions it had not needed to ask before, not about survival, but about justification. Why maintain certain forms? Why preserve certain routines? These inquiries remained procedural, but their presence mattered. The family's posture adjusted accordingly. Public appearances became more deliberate. Engagements were chosen strategically rather than habitually. Representation required calibration. Authority was still present, but it was no longer ambient. It had to be managed. The house did not weaken. It adapted. Its strength lay in its ability to absorb pressure without visible collapse. Systems adjusted incrementally. Language softened. Certainty yielded to assessment. The building remained authoritative, but its authority was no longer effortless. This phase did not resemble decline. Nothing had failed. The house stood exactly where it always had, but the alignment that once sustained inevitability had loosened. Power continued to reside within the walls, yet it now responded rather than simply existed. Pressure accumulated not as threat, but as requirement. The house entered a period where continuity depended not on assumption, but on adjustment. Adaptation altered the internal balance. What had once been routine now required justification. Decisions that previously passed without comment were documented, reviewed, and occasionally deferred. The system retained its precision, but its tempo changed. Time was no longer abundant, it was allocated. This recalibration reshaped authority. Senior roles shifted from stewardship toward management. Oversight intensified. The house did not lose control, but it redistributed it. Responsibility moved closer to metrics, further from intuition. Continuity was still valued, yet it now had to demonstrate efficiency. The staff absorbed these changes with restraint. Experience compensated for uncertainty. Knowledge once implicit became procedural. Training formalized. Redundancy was reduced cautiously. The system streamlined without dismantling itself. Its resilience depended on gradualism. Externally, perception evolved unevenly. Some institutions continued to treat the house as a stabilizing presence. Others engaged more selectively. Influence persisted, but it was no longer universal. The house's authority varied by context. It adapted by narrowing its focus rather than broadening its reach. Cultural legitimacy required active maintenance. Symbols that once spoke for themselves needed framing. Narratives were curated. The house explained itself more often, though always indirectly. Visibility increased, not as display, but as reassurance. Silence was no longer sufficient. Importantly, none of this produced rupture. The house remained operational. Its architecture still impressed. Its systems still functioned. The adjustments were contained, absorbed within existing structures. Adaptation did not contradict continuity, it redefined it. The house learned to move within constraints. It negotiated rather than assumed. Authority became situational. This did not weaken the institution immediately. In some ways, it strengthened it. Flexibility extended relevance. Responsiveness prevented fracture. Yet this phase introduced a new condition: awareness. The house became conscious of its position within larger systems. It no longer perceived itself as foundational, but as conditional. This awareness altered posture, tone, and expectation. The shift was subtle but enduring. Confidence gave way to competence. Certainty yielded to calibration. The house continued to stand, not because it was inevitable, but because it adapted carefully. Pressure did not produce collapse. It produced refinement. The house remained intact, functional, and authoritative, yet no longer unquestioned. It had entered a period defined not by dominance, but by management. Continuity persisted, but its meaning had changed. The shift was not framed as abandonment. It was framed as pragmatism. The house remained protected, its exterior maintained, its status formally intact. But the purpose of that protection changed. Where stewardship had once preserved authority through continuity, Preservation now served a narrower aim: retention of value. The house began to be understood less as a system to be sustained and more as an asset to be managed. This recalibration altered decision-making quietly. Long-term obligations were reassessed against short-term returns. Traditions once maintained for their stabilizing effect were simplified, abbreviated, or deferred. What could not demonstrate utility was questioned. What could not be justified economically was reinterpreted as excess. Financial structures moved closer to the surface. The house, once buffered from markets by confidence, entered them more directly. Assets associated with the estate were leveraged, reorganized, or separated. The building itself became part of a portfolio rather than the anchor of one. Value was quantified where it had once been assumed. This did not produce immediate degradation. Maintenance continued. Repairs were executed competently. The house still appeared orderly, but the rationale behind care shifted. Preservation aimed to prevent depreciation rather than to project permanence. The difference was subtle but consequential. Internally, systems adjusted again. Roles associated with continuity lost priority to those associated with efficiency. Expertise in tradition yielded to expertise in optimization. Decisions favored reversibility. Commitments shortened. The house learned to remain present without insisting on depth. Rituals changed first. Formal sequences were condensed. Events were standardized. What had once reinforced hierarchy through repetition now served function alone. The calendar thinned. Frequency replaced significance. Meaning became modular. The staff felt this shift most acutely. Knowledge that had once been cultivated across decades was no longer indispensable. Versatility replaced lineage. Experience remained respected, but it no longer structured authority. The system valued adaptability over inheritance. Continuity became optional. Language reflected the change. The house was increasingly described in terms of upkeep, usage, and cost. Discussions of legacy receded. Stewardship, once implicit, required explanation. When explanation became necessary, authority had already weakened. Externally, engagement narrowed further. The house participated selectively, often strategically. Relationships were evaluated for return rather than alignment. Influence persisted, but it was transactional. The mansion still opened its doors, but with clearer conditions. This phase did not feel like loss to those managing it. It felt responsible. Extraction was framed as sustainability. Simplification was framed as modernization. The house was still standing, still protected, still functioning, but its internal logic had inverted. Where stewardship once accepted cost in exchange for authority, extraction sought return in exchange for preservation. The house no longer absorbed resources to stabilize its environment. It drew value from its own existence. The building began to serve itself. Importantly, this did not announce decline. There were no visible failures. The mansion remained admired, photographed, maintained. Its silhouette still commanded attention. But the relationship between form and function loosened. Authority no longer flowed outward. Value flowed inward. The house entered a period where survival depended not on influence but on utility. Preservation continued, but its purpose had changed. What remained intact was structure. What began to hollow was meaning. As extraction became normalized, the house's internal orientation narrowed further. Decisions optimized for liquidity rather than continuity. Elements once maintained for coherence were isolated, monetized, or rendered dormant. The system remained functional, but it no longer functioned as a whole. Spatial use reflected this shift. Portions of the house were activated selectively, others closed or repurposed. Rooms that had once derived significance from sequence now stood independently, valued for individual utility rather than relational meaning. The building fractured into zones, each assessed separately. This segmentation altered perception. The house no longer presented itself as an integrated environment. It became legible in parts. Visitors encountered fragments rather than flow. The experience shifted from immersion to access. Presence became transactional. Operational discipline persisted, but its emphasis changed. Efficiency outweighed ritual. Predictability outweighed tradition. The system adapted to support intermittent use rather than continuous occupation. Authority was no longer performed daily, it was invoked when needed. Financial oversight tightened further. Costs were scrutinized for return. Investments prioritized visibility over depth. Preservation targeted surfaces most legible to valuation. What could not be seen or measured receded. Maintenance became selective. The staff structure responded accordingly. Specialized roles diminished. Contractual arrangements replaced long-term commitment. Institutional memory thinned. Knowledge became portable. The house retained labor, but not lineage. Externally, the house's identity continued to circulate, but its meaning flattened. It remained recognizable, even iconic, yet increasingly detached from lived authority. References persisted, but they pointed backward rather than outward. The mansion was known, not followed. This hollowing was not abrupt. It occurred through accumulation of small decisions, each reasonable in isolation. No single change dismantled stewardship. Instead, extraction replaced it incrementally, until preservation itself became the goal. The house remained protected, but against loss of value rather than erosion of meaning. Its survival strategy narrowed. Authority was no longer reproduced internally. It was converted into asset stability. What endured was the shell of governance. Procedures continued. Care was administered. The building did not decay, but the system that once generated power no longer operated in full. The house persisted without projecting order beyond itself. In this condition, the mansion stood not as a steward of hierarchy, but as a repository of capital. Its endurance was secured, but its influence had contracted. Preservation succeeded, even as authority dissipated. The house remained. What it no longer did was govern. The building survives without effort. Its walls remain aligned, its roof secure, its grounds contained. Preservation has succeeded in material terms. Yet survival now operates independently of meaning. What endures is form, detached from the system that once animated it. Inside, absence is not immediately visible. Rooms remain furnished. Objects retain placement. Pathways are unobstructed. But the rhythms that once synchronized these elements have dissipated. Movement no longer follows expectation. Time no longer accumulates. The house exists without momentum. Ritual was the first to vanish. Not abruptly, but through disuse. Sequences once repeated with precision lost relevance when no longer required. Meals ceased to structure days. Gatherings no longer reaffirmed hierarchy. What remained were isolated events, disconnected from continuity. Ritual depends on repetition. Once repetition falters, meaning dissolves quietly. Authority followed the same path. It did not collapse, it thinned. Decisions still occurred within the building, but they carried limited consequence beyond it. The house no longer produced alignment. It responded to external frameworks instead of shaping them. Influence became referential rather than directive. The internal logic that once governed daily life no longer coordinated action. Systems remained in place, but they no longer resolved into purpose. Maintenance continued without projection. Procedures persisted without outcome. The house functioned operationally, but not institutionally. Preservation filled the resulting void. Care replaced command. Documentation replaced instruction. The building's condition became its primary concern. Standards defined acceptable change. Intervention aimed to prevent loss rather than to enable use. The house entered a cycle of self-reference. This substitution altered perception. The building was no longer encountered as a place of order, but as a place to be protected. Its significance lay in endurance alone. The future was framed as continuation of the present, without ambition or expectation. Staff roles reflected this narrowing. Custodial expertise outweighed institutional knowledge. Tasks emphasized stabilization over coordination. Memory became archival rather than lived. The house retained competence, but lost direction. Externally, engagement adjusted accordingly. The building remained accessible, admired, and cited. Yet its presence no longer organized behavior beyond its boundaries. It existed as an object of interest rather than a point of orientation. Recognition persisted without consequence. This condition did not register as loss to all observers. Preservation appeared successful. The house was intact. Its appearance reassured continuity. But continuity now referred only to structure, not to function. The distinction was subtle but definitive. What remained was visibility without authority, order without governance, care without stewardship. The building survived precisely because it no longer attempted to exert influence. Its endurance depended on neutrality. What was gone was not grandeur or material richness, it was coordination. The house no longer synchronized people, time, and meaning. It did not require alignment. It accepted coexistence without hierarchy. The aftermath was not ruin. It was quiet separation. The building stood as it always had, yet no longer served as a system through which power moved. Preservation ensured survival, but survival alone proved insufficient to sustain purpose. The house remained present, but its internal logic had departed. What persists now is a different order, one defined by containment rather than direction. The house no longer generates patterns, it accommodates them. External schedules dictate opening hours. Regulatory frameworks define use. The building adapts to systems it once would have shaped. Authority has inverted. Memory within the house has shifted form. It no longer circulates through practice but through interpretation. Guides replace participants. Labels substitute for familiarity. The past is narrated rather than enacted. Knowledge exists, but it no longer organizes behavior. It informs without obligating. This transition alters the experience of time. The house no longer accumulates it. Days do not build upon one another. Events do not reinforce sequence. Each moment stands alone, unlinked from the next. Continuity survives as appearance, not process. The architecture absorbs this change without resistance. Walls remain silent. Corridors still connect rooms, though the logic that once governed movement has faded. Space retains its proportions, but no longer directs purpose. The building becomes permissive rather than prescriptive. Preservation frameworks formalize this condition. Guidelines specify what must remain unchanged, freezing elements in place. Adaptation is limited to protection. The house is preserved against erosion, but also against reinvention. Its survival depends on stasis. This stasis produces a particular calm. Without authority to maintain, there is little to contest. The building no longer provokes alignment or opposition. It exists within a neutral register. Attention replaces deference. Observation replaces participation. The loss of internal logic does not produce chaos. Instead, it produces quiet. The house functions smoothly within narrow bounds. It no longer demands coordination. It does not organize labor beyond maintenance. It does not shape social outcome. It endures without consequence. Externally, the house occupies a stable but reduced role. It is referenced as an example, a remnant, a site. It does not initiate. Its presence is acknowledged, not anticipated. The surrounding world continues without orienting itself toward the building. What has disappeared is not visible absence, but relational depth. The house no longer binds individuals into systems. It does not generate obligation. It does not absorb uncertainty. It no longer translates power into routine. These functions have migrated elsewhere, into forms without architecture. Preservation now serves as closure. By maintaining the building, the system signals that no further transformation is expected. The house is complete. Its role is finished. What remains is care without ambition. This does not diminish the structure. It clarifies it. The building stands as evidence of a logic that once operated fully, now resolved into form alone. It persists without projecting authority, without producing order beyond its walls. What remains is matter stabilized. What is gone is motion. The house endures, but it no longer governs time, behavior, or meaning. It has become what systems leave behind when they no longer require a center. The house remains, and with it, a question that was never meant to be asked aloud. It is not a question of loss, nor of blame. Nothing was taken. Nothing collapsed. The structure stands intact, preserved with care, recognized for its significance. And yet the system that once animated it no longer acts with conviction. The house survives, but it does so without expectation of return. What persists is presence without belief. This condition is not unique to the building. It reflects a broader American pattern, one in which elite structures endure materially while their internal confidence erodes. Power remains visible, but increasingly self-conscious. Authority continues, but it hesitates. The house becomes a lens through which this condition can be observed, quietly and without accusation. American elites have long avoided the language of inheritance. Continuity was framed as merit. Permanence was disguised as opportunity. The mansion once resolved this tension by embodying authority without naming it. It allowed power to exist without defending itself. That function depended on confidence not merely in resources, but in legitimacy. What changes when that confidence recedes? The house offers no dramatic answer. It does not fall into ruin. It does not become contested ground. Instead, it becomes careful. Decisions favor caution over assertion. Preservation replaces projection. The building no longer expects to shape the future. It aims to remain intact within it. This restraint is not humility. It is uncertainty disciplined by procedure. The house now operates within frameworks designed to prevent loss rather than enable dominance. It accepts oversight. It conforms to external narratives. It explains itself rather than assuming recognition. These are not signs of weakness, but they are signs of retreat. Authority persists, but it no longer trusts itself to expand. This shift raises a quiet question about elite survival in America. Is endurance alone sufficient? Can power persist indefinitely when it no longer believes in its own necessity? The house remains valuable, admired, protected. But value is not authority. Admiration is not alignment. What the building reveals is not decline, but transformation without replacement. The old logic has withdrawn, yet nothing new has fully taken its place. Preservation fills the gap, but preservation is inherently backward-looking. It stabilizes what exists. It does not generate purpose. The house continues to occupy space in the national imagination, but that space is static. It is referenced, not consulted. It is visited, not deferred to. Its survival depends on neutrality. It must not attempt to govern, because governance would require conviction. This is the quiet American question embedded in its walls. Not whether power should endure, but whether it can do so without belief. Not whether authority will disappear, but whether it can remain meaningful once it becomes self-protective. The mansion does not answer this question, it embodies it. It stands as evidence of a system that learned how to survive, but not how to renew itself. Its endurance is real, its confidence is not. The building remains present, stabilized within process, insulated from risk. What it no longer does is imagine itself as necessary. In this condition, the house no longer functions as an origin point. It does not generate direction, it absorbs interpretation. Meaning gathers around it, supplied by others, shaped by institutions external to its walls. The building becomes receptive rather than assertive, a surface onto which narratives are placed. This receptivity marks a profound inversion. Once, the house structured the terms under which it was understood. Now it accepts framing. Its identity is stabilized through designation rather than performance. It exists because it has been agreed upon, not because it compels agreement. The absence of belief does not produce emptiness immediately. Systems compensate. Procedures replace instinct. Oversight substitutes for confidence. The house continues to operate within carefully maintained limits, sustained by consensus rather than command. It survives through accommodation. This accommodation carries implications beyond the building itself. It reflects a mode of elite persistence that favors insulation over engagement. Power no longer expands outward, it consolidates inward. Survival becomes the objective, not influence. Presence is maintained, but projection is avoided. The house's silence is instructive. It does not contest its redefinition. It does not attempt to recover its former role. It remains available, stable, legible. Its restraint is not imposed. It is chosen. This choice reveals an elite posture that privileges continuity over relevance. What disappears in this posture is risk. Authority once involved exposure. It required assertion, alignment, and the possibility of refusal. Without belief in necessity, assertion becomes liability. The House resolves this by withdrawing from consequence. This withdrawal does not register as failure. It appears responsible. Preservation is praised, stability is rewarded. The House becomes an example of successful management, yet management is not authority. It does not organize the world beyond its remit. It does not shape outcomes. It cannot control. The mansion thus occupies a final position that is neither dominant nor obsolete. It remains physically central but functionally peripheral. It endures without directing, exists without insisting. Its authority has not been challenged. It has been set aside. What remains is a question that extends beyond architecture. When power survives by refusing to believe in itself, what exactly is being preserved? Structure without ambition, continuity without obligation, presence without consequence. The House offers no resolution. It stands, maintained and contained, as a record of an elite logic that chose endurance over renewal. Its walls hold no answer, only evidence. The quiet American question persists, not because the House asks it, but because it no longer can.